Say anything in here.
Let's see,
And
Molly.
then they said,
Molly, sit right in front of me, because I know that we can take these chairs up. Just sit like right here.
Okay.
Anytime, just kind of tap my shoulder. Mark, can you go?
I don't know how many people have other meetings. I don't know how many people have other meetings.
Well, there's a bunch, but I know that there's going to be a couple coming in, so we're going to get started.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, what did you say? The mission of my department? Okay, yes. Okay. John Oxendine, State Insurance Safety Fire Commissioner. Actually, the department covers various areas. Obviously, as Insurance Commissioner, our duties are in two main categories. One is to help consumers with various problems that they have, getting claims paid, answering questions, telling them their rights. We actually have a staff of people that are there from 7 in the morning till 8 at night to actually answer the phone and help your constituents and mine. Also, we're in charge of insurance solvency issues, and we oversee solvency in the P&C area. We have a great deal of rating authority in the life and health area, little to no rating authority and overseeing rates. As Safety Fire Commissioner, the Fire Marshal's Office is a division of our office. We're in charge of inspecting buildings, doing arson, or not doing arson, but investigating arson. Writing the state fire code, investigating buildings, all hazardous materials, automobile racing, and manufactured housing regulation also come under that. And I'm the industrial loan commissioner. We regulate the small industrial loan companies, not the payday lenders, not the pawn shops, but the small industrial loan companies or finance companies. And also, I'm the comptroller general, and we have various duties along with the governor and other members of the State Depository Board overseeing the assets of the state in that capacity. As far as the 06 supplemental budget, there is one recommendation from OPB, and that recommendation is for $11,303. That's to reflect an increase in workers' compensation premium that we would have to pay for our insurance coverage. There is also another item that was not included. We didn't actually make this request to OPB. The reason is because we were told not to make the request to OPB, and generally it's better not to do something to them that they tell you not to do because they get upset sometimes. But I would like to bring to the committee's attention an issue of great concern. Because mainly in the fire marshal's office, our agency is a small agency. We have proportionally a very high number of employees that travel, and a large number of these employees have their own personal car, do not have a state issue car, and literally their car is their office. They don't have an office. They leave their house, they travel around the state. It's mainly in the fire marshal's office. These are building inspectors, these are hazardous material inspectors. With the increase in the mileage reimbursement, we were running last year, depending on the month, we were averaging around $30,000 per month in mileage reimbursement. We are now running around $40,000 per month in mileage reimbursement. Really, the difference is really potential shortfall of about $90,000 for the end of the year, where money could be moved from various places. We went through looking, we found a few dollars here and there in other places. We feel confident we can get that shortfall down to $50,000. We found another $40,000 here and there, but we're very concerned that we might have a shortfall of $50,000 at the end of the year. It's solely, I do agree that the mileage reimbursement needed to be changed, and it was appropriate for it to be changed, but for a small agency that has a huge number of people that drive a personal car all day to every corner of the state to do these inspections, it's hitting us very hard, and we're trying to absorb it as much as we can. And I'll be happy to supply the committee with an actual detailed breakdown of this impact in our agency, but we would appreciate it if y'all would consider that request. Like I said, it would be about 90, but we feel we can come up with 40 ourselves. If you could help us with that other 50, we'd greatly appreciate it. And that's all I have, unless you have any questions, Mr. Chair.
Do we have any questions from the subcommittee? Yes, Mr. Carter.
Commissioner Oxendine, I would like to just commend your office. We talked in years past in my professional architecture throughout the state of the inspection process and plan review process out of the State Fire Marshal's office. And in particularly, you do a great job with plan review and a speedy and timely turnaround of those reviews. But in the inspections of new construction across the state. You have one of the best and understanding group of inspectors of any sort of permitting review possible. So just your people are to be commended. They're doing a great job.
Thank you very much, Representative Hurd. I hope we can continue to reimburse them for their mileage so we can get to do those inspections. It might get hairy toward the end of the year.
Representative Maxwell?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Oxton, I tell you how much I appreciate what your department does.
Thank you.
What you accomplish for us. Thank you very much. Now, the 310 positions, and how many of your people you think actually are on the road?
We can give you the exact figures. Do you have an estimate?
We have 68 people we have 252 people for filled positions, and those 68 people are on the road.
Yeah, the 310 is authorized. We don't have near that many filled positions.
252 are filled.
And they're not filled because of lack of budget. It's not that they're just not filled. We only have the budgeting for 270. And we have 65 traveling constantly. 68 constantly traveling that have no office.
Now, the 07 budget, do you have funds provided in the 07 budget? I know we're talking to 06 now, but did y'all put that?
I think we're going to have to ask for that.
We're gonna have, we would.
Yeah, OPB did not address that issue adequately, so we will have to make a request for 07. You know, a lot of agencies, most of their people are here or in an office, and it's not as bad, but the nature of inspecting gas stations, propane gas, buildings, with hazmat and building inspections, that's just the nature of their job. Is you got to go where the site is, and that requires so much mileage. Yeah, we're going to have to ask for it in 07.
Thank you, Representative Maxwell. Any other questions from the subcommittee? I don't see any. Commissioner, thank you for coming. We were hoping that you could actually identify some places where we could cut some money. This is entirely unexpected. If you would do this, I appreciate you making the presentation on the request here. If you could have your office, I'd ask you to, if you have your office, just give us a little written
We will.
explanation of that and what your funds are looking for.
We will have that promptly.
We'll do everything we can. Obviously, we have to find cuts. I mean, in all honesty, we have to find cuts someplace to make up for anything that we have, but we'll do everything that we can to help out with that. I know it is a concern, and it's an issue, I should say. It's an issue that was presented to me not long after we changed that back in September when it was voted by some other departments. So I know it is an issue, and we'll do everything we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for indulging my schedule as well.
Thank you. Is the Secretary of State's office, okay, I see. Secretary of State, Madam Secretary of State.
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. And good afternoon. We're going to follow along on your tracking sheet for the most part, but we've got a handout that we're going to pass along to you as well. In terms of our 06 amended budget request, it's fairly simple. Some of it are the routine items for workers' comp premium increases. The Real Estate Commission has a request for to replace 2 high-mileage vehicles that you see. There's some kind of finish-up money for transferring the filing functions to the Ethics Commission in the amount of $16,000. The big-ticket item has to do with last year's reapportionment. As you might remember, when we were in the middle of last year's session and the new reapportionment plans were adopted, we came to you at that point to talk about the cost, because we were talking to you in the budget process before the actual redistricting was passed. It was the recommendation of the General Assembly that we wait and come back in the amended budget to get those costs taken care of. And the fact is, what we're bringing you, as much as $964,000 is a lot of money, it's actually less than we were projecting during the session last year, because once we got the actual maps and were able to pinpoint out exactly what the cost would be, the breakdown basically has to do with the printing and the mailing of the new voter cards to all of the voters who get put into new districts because of reapportionment. So the cost we had asked for and what the governor has recommended is a total of $964,923, and we hope that you will go along with the governor's recommendation on that item. That's really what you have on your tracking sheet. What I want to bring up, I know it always makes an Appropriations Committee happy to hear, are the things that are not on the tracking sheet, that are the late come expenses. The letter you have, we distributed earlier to Chairman Parsons and Chairman Harbin, has to do with the legal expenses of the litigation that is going on about the photo ID lawsuit. And let me give you a little bit of background about legal fees in lawsuits. In the 10 years that I have now been working in the Secretary of State's office, whenever we have had lawsuits about reapportionment, about any election issues, when the Ethics Commission has had lawsuits, if the law department decides to hire outside attorneys, they send those bills to our agency. And in the 10 years that I've been in this office, in every situation, the governor's office has always found funding to pay those legal fees and transferred those to the budget of the Secretary of State's office. That happened under Governor Miller, that happened under Governor Barnes, and that has previously happened under Governor Perdue in the reapportionment litigation. When we started getting the legal bills, I'm the named defendant, as you know, in the photo ID lawsuit. I have no choice but to be in that lawsuit. I have no choice but to get the legal bills paid once the Attorney General hires lawyers to defend this case. Then I did the normal course of things. I sent the legal bills, which did not come into us until November. They were not sent to us when state agencies turn in our budget request in September, but truthfully, this process has never been handled through the budget request because you try to obviously get your bills paid before the supplemental or the next budget would be available this spring. So if I'd had the bills, I don't know that I would have submitted them because that had never been the course. But I wrote a letter to the governor and asked, in the course of the way things have been operated for the last decade, that he transfer money from the governor's discretionary fund to pay the outstanding legal fees, which currently are $187,000 and some odd cents. The governor wrote back and said that he would not pay those legal bills, that I had not submitted them in time to be considered for the budget request, and that he was no longer paying those legal fees out of a discretionary fund. So my choice was to go to the legislature. Last week we had a state election board meeting of which I chair, and the issue came up because the state election board voted to intervene in the lawsuit. So the state election board as an entity is also a defendant in the lawsuit. It doesn't necessarily mean they're more legal cost. I mean, they're doing the same, the lawyers do the same defense for the state election board as they do for me as Secretary of State. But the election board had a couple of votes that I discussed with you in this letter, number one of which is for the supplemental budget. The vote of the state election board is to ask you to appropriate the $187,000 to pay the existing and now past due legal fees, plus an additional $300,000 in the supplemental budget based on what the lawyers tell us is likely to be billed for us between now and June 30th. We have, this matter is now pending in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. There'll be oral arguments on this issue coming up in March, and I hate to tell you, but no matter what you do on Senate Bill 84, that's still going forward. And the lawyers do not believe that the passage of Senate Bill 84 is just going to make this lawsuit disappear. At a minimum, they believe we're going to have to go through this 11th Circuit process to have the 11th Circuit decide whether or not the passage of the new legislation really does impact the pendency of this current lawsuit. So the first issue that we are putting before you in this letter is the vote of the State Election Board that you appropriate funds to pay the legal fees for the defense of the statute in the amount of $487,000 as we spell out in the letter. There was a second vote of the election board based on our discussions with the lawyers on what we could anticipate in terms of legal fees and cost for the next calendar year, anticipating that if we don't get money put in the big budget, then we won't be able to pay any more legal fees until next March or April or June. And the lawyers estimated that we could see as much as $2 million in legal fees and cost to be incurred by the state in the next calendar year. So the second part of the request from the board is that you appropriate in the big budget $2 million in terms of the legal fees. Now, when you say, well, surely the passage of the new legislation will stop this lawsuit for the next year, but what the lawyers tell us, the feedback they are getting from the plaintiffs' attorneys, is that they will amend the current lawsuit to continue challenges against Senate Bill 84. So, unfortunately, this is not something that the passage of the new law is just going to make litigation go away. It's going to be there. We have an obligation to defend the statute, and we have an obligation for the state to pay the bills. So that's kind of an overview of where we are on the legal fee issue. But for the amended budget, your session today, and I know your narrow focus, is the $487,000 for the current and immediately likely to be incurred legal fees. The other issue that I want to mention to you in terms of the supplemental is that with the passage of Senate Bill 84, there are some expenses mentioned in that legislation that you've been discussing. Number one of which is that every county voter registrar's office will now have to make photo identification cards available to anyone who comes into them. That means computer equipment, photo equipment, printing equipment, laminating equipment, or some system, as shall be determined, I guess, by the State Board of Elections, as the bill spells it out. There is no money. The State Election Board has no budget whatsoever. Yet this bill specifies that the State Election Board will furnish to every county all of the equipment necessary to produce the IDs at no cost to people who, say they don't have other forms of ID, that the State Election Board will provide supplies, maintenance, training for this photo ID equipment. So there is no funding whatsoever existing to do that. We certainly have not put out an RFP or anything like that to look at it. We've had my procurement officer do just some very early preliminary kind of calling around to see what a decent type of secure card would cost, one that might have some type of hologram imprinted on it. What we understand was shown at one of the hearings was sort of a, college campus corner. Anybody can make one of these type IDs that I don't know that you want the state of Georgia to be issuing when it could be easily replicated. Early estimates, again, no RFP, no competitive bids have been taken in this process, is that the cost for the equipment alone is likely to be about $6,000 per county. That's just our earliest estimates to give you some ballpark idea of what you need to think about. That does not include any of the training to train 159 county voting registrars on how to use this equipment, what types of ID are going to be acceptable to issue the ID, and all of that kind of thing. And I'll give you a ballpark of comparison. When the legislature appropriated money for voter education when we moved into electronic voting, you appropriated about $4.5 million for voter education. I'm not saying you've got to have that much for this, but to think you're going to be able to put in $25,000 and do any kind of semblance of voter education is not realistic. For For states this large with 4.5 million registered voters, it will take a sum of money to do voter education. The other part in terms of this process is the maintenance and the training of counties. I would certainly hope that whoever is in charge, state election board or whoever, of getting this equipment to the counties, that we not go hire permanent state employees to do the maintenance on these things. It ought to be part of a contract with a vendor who can be available when they need it, because the bulk of the maintenance is going to be needed in the 45 days before an election, and you're just not going to want to pay for, nor do I think it is productive to hire all that many state employees who can run around the state in those 45 days to maintain this equipment when it breaks. I think it'll be much more cost effective to do that in a maintenance contract. So there are a lot of issues that I hope you will consider in terms of supporting that legislation, which is now passed and on its way to the governor's office, because right now there is no funding whatsoever for the state election board to take care of those activities. With that good news, that's our presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Quite a presentation. Do we have questions from the subcommittee? Okay, Representative Smith. You do?
Thank you for your presentation. If we're to present numbers to the decision makers that deal with this, how quickly could you put together your information on dollars and costs and everything?
Well, I have a handout that I'll give you that my procurement officer put together in his calling around that we'll be glad to give you, and we'll be glad to go back and do whatever kind of research you want us to do to come up with some other numbers. I just ask him to do this just to give you some ballpark idea, because my understanding is that in some of the committee discussions there was a discussion that this could be done for about $1,000 a county, and that is just not realistic. So if you want it to be done, I think you want it to be done right and in a good way, and with a card that is not going to be in and of itself an instrument for fraud.
Questions? Representative Mills?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Secretary of State, Kathy, on the page 2 of the handout that you handed out regarding the legal costs, on the back you talk about the state election board also voted that you request an additional $2 million. Is this part of the amount that you're anticipating for future legal fees?
Right, in the next calendar year, from July 1 of this year through next year. Assuming, as our lawyers are predicting to us, that with the new legislation, there is likely to be either a new lawsuit, a wholly new lawsuit, or an amendment to the existing lawsuit that will keep this thing going. Back to the district court, back to the appellate courts. Lots of people are predicting that this is going to work its way up to the Supreme Court. And truthfully, the Supreme Court is not where you'd have the most cost. It's at the district court level. And so none of our lawyers suggest to us that this is going to be over anytime soon.
It seemed to me in your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not just going on what you said, but it seemed to me that you kind of resented the fact being the defendant on this.
Well, it's an awkward position. There's no doubt about it. You all know I have not been in favor of this form of photo ID. I'm all for voter ID. I wrote the law that you passed in 1997. But, I'm not here to debate with you. You're the policymakers. You get to make the call. I want to administer the law. But I also am a little bit frustrated that despite 10 years of practice where we didn't have to worry about paying legal expenses for the state of Georgia, we're in a situation now where I have to ask you to budget legal fees when I really don't know what to anticipate. Certainly, anything you put in the budget for legal fees supplemental or in next year's budget, if you put a line item in that, the budget for that matter, it can't be used for anything else. And if we don't have $2 million in legal fees, that will lapse and go back to the Treasury. It can't be spent on some other item. I hate to ask for that kind of money for legal fees for anything with the other needs of the state, but I also, as a constitutional officer, am obligated to assure that the state pays its bills.
I want to make sure I understood what you were saying earlier. In all the previous prior situations, you say for the past 10 years, these were paid out of the emergency fund of the government. And in each one of those previous situations, were the bills turned in at this late date?
Turned in all year round. Turned in, I mean, the timing has never been an issue. The governor would send a letter back to us or his executive secretary saying, we are on this date transferring $212,000 to the budget of the Secretary of State's office for the payment of legal fees as outlined on Attachment A. I mean, this has just been the routine course of, because no state agency really knows how to handle legal fees when you're hit with any kind of lawsuit that you don't anticipate. And very, very few of us know how to anticipate it. I respect the governor's right to say, I don't use the discretionary fund for that, but there needs to be some instrument in government to pay unanticipated legal fees, not just for me, but for every state agency that are going to come up during the year and not have to hold lawyers who you want to get good lawyers to represent the state. But if all of a sudden it becomes the practice that if you get assigned or asked to represent the state of Georgia for any matter and you're not going to be paid for a year until the next budget cycle runs around, it's going to completely change the face of how we get legal representation, and that's just not been the practice in the past.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Sure.
About this, and I found the governor to be a fair and reasonable man, and I would. Was there some notice given that, or in the past, that these amounts this much?
Oh, they were much more than this. Much more than this.
Was there a notice that these were coming around the corner, Governor, need for you to consider this?
No, but that's never been the case. You know, to send a bill over for $187,000. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me to think about paying those kind of legal fees. But the reapportionment law legal fees were in the millions. They didn't all come at one time, but we had different bills that came in every couple of months. The lawyers don't necessarily bill us every month.
I can fully understand at that time why they want to pay those reapportionment fees.
Well, and I mean that's included paying, in reapportionment we've had to pay the legal fees of the winning side, and those have come out of. I don't want to say they've always come out of the discretionary fund or the emergency fund. That has been my understanding. But from whatever source, it has never been an issue when we had legitimately incurred legal expenses for any type of lawsuit in my office over 10 years. We sent them over to the governor's office to be evaluated, and they transferred the money. We didn't even have discussion about it.
May I ask one last question?
Yes.
What happens in the event that the General Assembly does not fund this?
We'll be sued by our own lawyers, to get our bills paid. And I don't think that's a black eye that the General Assembly wants the state to wear. And it would have, I think, a devastating impact on the quality of lawyers we can attract to represent us in any variety of issues, from environmental causes to election matters to anything that any state agency gets involved in. If lawyers know they're not going to be paid, or they're going to have to wait a year for another budget cycle to be paid, or they're going to have to turn around and sue their own clients to get paid, then no decent lawyers are going to want to represent the state of Georgia.
Thank you, Representative Nicholl. Representative Mike, do you have a
Yes, sir.
I suppose there's two questions. The first one, and I hope I know the answer to this, but sure to goodness, we just pay the defendant's side and not the plaintiff's side also with all this money.
No, absolutely.
On your second letter here that you sent to the Honorable 3rd of April back in September, you respectfully request that the attorneys in his office defend the suit. Who hired the attorneys? Did his office or your office hire them?
No, the Attorney General gets to make that decision as to whether they want their in-house lawyers to handle it or they want to assign it out to what we call Special Assistant Attorney Generals. He's never hired, never had a budget to do that. The practice, and I cannot tell you whether that's a statutorily based practice or just the habit, is he makes the call on whether to hire outside attorneys, and when he does, he simply forwards the bill to that particular state agency. Well, that's definitely true.
Have you heard a response, or has he responded back to you about your request that he use our own in-staff attorneys on staff?
They told me that the litigation would be too time-consuming for their staff attorneys to be able to handle and to adequately defend the statute. I will say, Representative Maxwell, that I don't think there's any problem if the legislature decided to put money in the Attorney General's budget to pay these kind of fees. I don't think it doesn't have to come in the Secretary of State's office. If you put it in his budget, it could still go for the same purpose if you line item it.
Any other questions from members of the subcommittee? That appears to be all the questions from the subcommittee. I find it puzzling. I don't know what the governor, and I can't second guess at all. I just find it puzzling. I don't know where that money's supposed to come from.
Well, it is a very serious question that needs to be addressed, and if the governor has decided to change the policy on how you pay these unanticipated legal fees, then sort of as Representative Maxwell suggests, there really ought to be an ongoing source in the Attorney General's budget to pay legitimate legal fees and lapse whatever you don't have at the end of the year, because we're going to get in a very, very serious bind if it doesn't come from either place.
Well, we've heard your testimony today, and we appreciate that. And without further information, it seems to me that the $187,000 would be our first concern here, because these projected costs you haven't been charged with those yet.
Those are the bills that have been given to us as of the end of December. Oh yes, the $187,000 are the bills from the two law firms now representing us as of the end of December. But we know, for example, that we have oral argument coming up in March in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So we know, and that's where the lawyers have given us this $300,000 figure for what is likely to be incurred in this budget year.
But those really aren't, you don't have bills for those as of now. The $300,000 is projected. You don't have bills for those as of now, but you do have for $187,000.
That's correct.
So if at this point it's not going to be paid out of discretionary fund or whatever, if it's not going to be this $187,000, then we do have an issue that we need to somehow address. I don't know that we can handle it and take care of it, but we need to address. But we don't know for the $300,000. Have you received any information from the governor's office that says he's just not going to use any of that money, or that he's not going to, that the governor's office is not going to pay any of these costs?
His letter said we no longer pay bills like that out of the discretionary fund, that you should deal with this with the legislature.
All right. I think we have another question here, but I am puzzled by what, how, like you say, if we don't pay the bills, then it creates another problem. I'm hoping there's an answer someplace. It just hasn't come up yet. I'm just hoping there's got to be an answer someplace, surely, other than just coming to the Appropriations Committee projections, and we can't add anything, so we have to cut someplace. It just seems like a funny, peculiar situation for you to be in, actually.
For any state agency. I mean, there in somewhere in state government, there has to be a source to pay legal fees.
Thank you. We have a question from Representative.
I do, just based on past processes primarily. First question being the $187,000. You said that came due in December?
Right.
It's just been posted due.
Well, that's a combination, I guess. You know, the litigation started in the late fall. The first bills apparently were sent in late October to the Attorney General's office, and they came to our office in November. The Attorney General gets the bills, they evaluate them to make sure they're in line, and then they send them on to the state agency. So they came to us in late November, and that's when we wrote the letter to the governor's office and kind of went back and forth in December in discussions with them, and then got the letter that we needed to address this to your attention.
And due to what it is, it would have been hard-pressed to anticipate such a controversy going on. So in previous governor administrations, those unanticipated expenses coming out of emergency fund, I'm wondering that in this case, since we did have a year of some national disasters that tapped into what would have been the emergency fund and the discretionary funds, and maybe we need the governor in to respond as to is it due to the timeliness of it that the discretionary fund could be tapped out, or was it specifically that regardless of funds, these expenses?
We'll be glad to furnish you with a copy of the governor's letter, but he said you should have sent these when you sent in your budget request in September. We didn't have any bills. You know, we couldn't have sent them in. And as I said, I don't know that I would have sent them in because it's never been handled in the budget. And I didn't want to if I had had a bill in September, I would not have wanted to wait until this budget's going to be available in March or April to pay my bills. So it really wouldn't have occurred to me to use that process. But be that as it may, the governor's letter said, you didn't submit it in time for me to put it in my budget. We don't use our discretionary fund for that purpose anymore. You should deal with the legislature. We'll be glad to furnish you all with a copy.
Thank you. Representative Parrish has a question. Do you know, what's your
Secretary of State, let me ask you a couple of questions for us non-lawyers to try to help us understand this. You were named as a defendant in this simply because you're the chief elected official for the state, right?
Right.
So therefore, the obligation of that bill is going to come to you, even though you're not responsible for the lawsuit.
The same with reapportionment. I didn't have anything to do with reapportionment, but I was the defendant because I administer elections.
And then you touched on this, and I want to make sure I understand this right. At the time that the budgets were submitted to OPB, y'all did not have the bills that were coming due, so you were not able to submit those in your budget request.
That's correct.
And, Mr. Chairman, I wish we could ask somebody from OPB or something. I think in the past that when things like this came up and it was funded out of the discretionary fund, the emergency fund, or whatever you want to call it, they came back to the legislature and requested money be put back into the governor's emergency fund to offset those in years past and funding.
I think the proper time when OPB is actually here today, so that we're able to cover that stuff. You have any questions?
I think that's correct, Representative Parrish. And I think I recall seeing sort of some descriptions in the budget, you know, that $500,000 was being put in the governor's discretionary fund to cover Jones versus Smith.
And I guess one last question, if we don't, as a state, come up with some $487,000, probably 187 we know for sure, and the others anticipate in this fiscal year to pay our bills, we're going to be in arrears with paying our bills in a timely fashion in the state. Is that not?
That's exactly right.
Thank you, Representative Parrish. I think Representative Hill, you have a question, sir?
Yes, Madam Secretary, could you please go over those dates again? I'm trying to get my timeline. The Attorney General's office started receiving these bills, you say in the fall?
I think we noted in terms of date stamps that the bills were first received in the Attorney General's office sometime in late October. And those were the first bills that the Attorney General's office got from the time the lawsuit began. They evaluate those bills and then send them to us, and we got the bills November 4th. We got the first bill November 4th, and then we got several subsequent bills during the month of November, and then we sent actually 2 letters to the governor saying we've got bills in this amount, and then we sent another letter about a week later saying now we've got this amount.
Do you know about when the AG hired these firms? Approximate month?
I don't remember when the litigation started, in August or September. It was, I just really I don't want to give you the wrong date. It was after the bill got pre-cleared from the Justice Department, so they had a...
Had to be around that date, September 28th, because he had just appointed them then.
Was that our letter? Our letter to the Attorney General was dated in September 28th of when we asked the Attorney General. Yeah.
At any time, did the AG's office give you any sort of guesstimate? I'm looking at what perhaps what we might want to do in the future, get the notification as early as possible, and I would thought they would have forwarded that on through to you so you might be able to use that for budgeting. But apparently that was not the case.
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Nicholl. I believe that's given us all the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We will take these under consideration, and we will try to help if we can. I mean, we'll try to address these issues
I appreciate it.
that way. Thank you very much.
We'll provide you with the governor's letter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's see, I think we have some past agencies, the Secretary of State's office that are here. We have Methodist.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
If you would introduce yourself, sir, and tell us the mission of your agency or your sub-agency.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Rick Thompson. I am the Interim Executive Secretary for the State Ethics Commission, and right now our mission is to survive. The passage of House Bill 48, which enhanced the Ethics in Government Act and gave a lot more responsibilities to the State Ethics Commission, both in disclosure and becoming the filing officer, having the duties transferred from the Secretary of State's office after 30 years to the State Ethics Commission. Luckily, a lot of the filing will now be done electronic, so that helps out as far as space goes. We have some handouts that, if you want them, we'll give them to you now. Otherwise, we'll just bring by your office later. What we're looking for is, I believe in the tracking sheet, the governor has recommended around $16,000 for us. We've asked for $1.1 million just for the supplemental. After we prorate the salaries and the office space, it comes to $672,000 after we prorate it. We need this for personnel and office space mainly. The rest comes in computers, moving expenses, and different things like that. With House Bill 48, one of the things we had to do is issue lobbyist badges, as you may have noticed, a lot like the ID badges that maybe the Secretary of State's office will have to issue later on. The problem with this is that this was an unfunded mandate. So what we did is we just took the money that we already had in our budget and tried to make these badges in such a way that they'd be acceptable not only to the lobbyists, but also to the legislators and the intent of House Bill 48. We're also trying to prepare to accept all electronic filings, especially since this is an election year. We'll have a lot more campaign finance reports coming to us electronically. Right now we have 2 servers where we need about 10 more servers just to back up our lobbyist filing, which is electronic, our financial disclosures, which are electronic, and our campaign finance, which will be electronic as well. In our budget request, we are also asking, if you'll see in the computer equipment when we pass it out, there's $302,000. $125,000 of that is for scanning equipment. Currently, the Secretary of State, or in the past, they have scanned campaign finance reports that have been sent to them in a paper format. The law does not mandate that everybody has to file electronically with the State Ethics Commission. Once you exceed $10,000, you have to file electronically. So we will still be receiving paper campaign contribution disclosure reports. In addition, we will be receiving affidavits from anybody, whether they're on a city-county level filing electronically with their filing officer, or whether they're filing electronically with the State Ethics Commission. The law mandates that they print off an affidavit or have an affidavit. Our computer programmer has designed that the affidavit will be printed off once you submit it to us. You just have to sign it and notarize it. But we have to store all that paperwork. If you've ever seen our office, it's my understanding we are in an old storage closet for some reason. We do not have very much space at all. We do not have enough space for the 8 people we have right now, and that's all our agency has is 8 people. We have 10 positions, 1 unfunded, and 1 recently vacated, as you may know. So unless we receive at least the $672,000 just in the supplemental, then we do not know how we're going to enforce or go forward with the with House Bill 48 and its mandates.
Thank you. We have any questions? Subcommittee. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Nice to meet you. I want to push it right now. I do have some questions, just trying to understand. When you inherited this agency, were there fund transfers from the Secretary of State's office to yours?
Initially, it was proposed that $300,000 be transferred to the State Ethics Commission. However, we received $106,000 for personnel, but the $200,000 it was retracted from us by OPB and SOS. I don't understand the whole procedure. I know that the Secretary of State's office would be able to explain that, or OPB would in more detail, but I don't understand how that happens.
You're doing a great job.
All right, thank you.
That's a plus for me when I thought that very much. I'm just teasing here. I do have a couple more questions, and it's to help you and to help us understand this.
Okay.
Why did your agency have to absorb the fees for the badges that were created from, absorb the cost? Why couldn't you charge a processing fee for the badges? And do
Right.
you need enabling legislation to do that, or what's the problem there?
Over 10 years ago, the State Ethics Commission was enjoined by a federal injunction from enforcing registration fees that are currently in the law. Last year, we tried to pass legislation that we believed would be constitutional. However, the General Assembly put back in the same language that we're enjoined from enforcing anyway. So we weren't able to do it last year. What we have done is that last year we had a huge problem with lobbyists losing their badges or wanting extra ones. We are charging for replacement badges to try to offset the cost. Each badge we issue is $20. That's what it costs us. So, and right now we have something like 1,300 lobbyists, and 1,100 we have made badges for already.
So, we do have a role in the General Assembly to help you offset that cost, but so far we've not passed enabling legislation for that.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I wouldn't disagree with that. But I mean, yes. I mean, generally speaking, I believe most states have, if there's an ID badge issued for lobbyists, I believe they have a fee or a cost that they put in there to offset that.
If you don't mind, if you're familiar with a couple examples from some states that you feel like would fit your system that you're developing, just let us know that. No promises here.
Right.
It's something we need to look into.
And we can get you a list of those states because we have to get the badge replacement fees. You know, we figured out what we were doing, but we didn't want to exceed it, so we did compare it to a couple other states, so we can get you that information.
Thank you.
Okay.
In the past, when legislators have filed, a lot of them have purchased their own software that is complementary to
Yes.
the Secretary of State software. And I'm not probably as technically savvy as a lot of other people are. So I plug along, but please tell me it's going to be user-friendly.
Yes and no. We have the capability of making it user-friendly, okay? Before the March the 31st report, unlike the Secretary of State's filing program, theirs was a software-based where you had to download a program one time or another, and you had to use that one computer to log on and file your reports. We have a web-based program, and that just means you log on to the internet and you just enter the information into the internet. Well, if you have 10 people helping you, all 10 people can log on at the same time and enter in different things, okay? We have the capability of allowing what they call third-party vendor filing, okay? The problem is it will cost around $85,000 to have the programmer to program it, to generate the specs, to send out to the software companies, so the software companies can then send it back to us saying, okay, we followed along exactly what you have. It's basically like building a bridge between theirs and ours. Then we have to test that to make sure that they did everything we asked them to and that they complied with the specs and the law. Send it back to them, have them correct whatever they need to correct, and then they will send it back for another test run. And when that's done, we will be able to accept that. Our director of IT comes from the state of Missouri, he has experience with third-party vendor filings and doing the specs. So he's done it before. He knows how to do it. But there's one staff person that needs to be dedicated to that. And then we also have to have the space and the time. And he says it will take at a minimum 3 months. So even if we got the money for that right now, the March the 31st report will have to be hand-entered is the way it's looking.
When you say hand-entered, you mean each person filing all over the state who has to meet this requirement will have to re-enter all their data? Is that
Just for between January 1st and March the 31st. Okay. I mean, the past data will not be carried forward anyway because they're just two entirely different systems. Okay. And the Secretary of State's office was kind enough to offer their program to us, but it was a software program. It was limiting. If you wanted to file an amendment, you have to go back to the same computer. It was old technology, and we would have to spend more money updating it with the changes of the new law and also fixing some errors that it had that we heard about that it had in the old law. They would just cost more to do it that way than to actually do the web system.
So, and thank you. You're doing great, by the way.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that. But what I want to know is this. To do your job in March and to keep some peace among all the elected people all over the state, do you need some kind of legislative waiver or something like that to accept a paper filing in the beginning and some scanning equipment?
Well,
what makes it work?
it-
It doesn't sound like it's going to work.
If you were to say, well, you know, the State Ethics Commission or General Assembly decides that the State Ethics Commission should receive paper, we have a whole new problem. Where are we going to store the paper? We don't even have file cabinets in our office. Okay, we have very few file cabinets, and that would be a lot of paper. So we wouldn't even know how.
So what's
Well,
no, but 3 months won't. I mean,
it's
3 months.
it still won't.
We're not problem solving yet, are we?
No, and I belabored this point with our director of IT, and he says it's just going to take that long because not only are you working on our time schedule, but also the vendors. They have to take the time to actually reprogram their software to meet the specs and new requirements of the law.
Probably what we do here, Mr. Chair, if you indulge me a little bit longer.
Go right ahead.
I'm trying to remember the committee that, the legislative committee that ethics legislation passes through. I'm not sure. It is next. It is not, all right. The ethics, not the panel, but the committee. Okay, all right. So probably what we need to do is to ensure that you get before that committee quickly to have a good dialogue on how to problem solve in March, because it sounds like a challenge. But thank you for at least making us aware of it.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Smith. I think Representative Maxwell, you have a question?
I did a long time ago, but I think Representative Smith covered all that. Thank you.
Representative Hill.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm not sure, perhaps you could answer this, I'm not sure. I'm a little confused on, page 101 of the 06 budget.
Tracking document.
Tracking documents, yes, out of the amended.
You got it done.
Yes,
What page?
101. I see that the State Ethics Commission was budgeted, current budget was 824,000 with the recommendation of an additional 17,000 coming to a total of 886,000. $41,000 for this year '06. Those funds, or I know we're part of the way through the year, so but those aren't available to you? Is that what I'm,
Well,
it looks like they were appropriated.
the majority of those funds, Representative, the $718,000 was our core budget. Okay, that's what we ran our 9-person agency and everything we do on that budget for '06. The extra money that was in there is the transfer, I believe, from the Secretary of State's office of roughly $106 for the personnel. Those funds are being expended just to do our day-to-day operations, as the Commission has done over the past couple decades. There wasn't anything extra besides that 106, which we used for personnel because we had the budget lapse or lapse factors or something that was going to put us $125,000 in the red for our personnel. So with that $106,000 from the Secretary of State, but we only got 6 months of it to transfer over.
And the other 6 months is in this year's budget. That's what
Okay, in this year's budget, right.
That's
All we have is the $106,000 because as the figures you're going off is the $800 and some thousand dollars we're talking about. Okay,
Trying to figure out where the money's going.
well, we could definitely show you by our expenditures of where the money's going. In the past, we have printed out the Ethics in Government Act for our computers, for our staff. The majority of that goes for our 9-person agency and our rent, phones, and different things like that. I would be more than happy to provide all the expenditures that we have up to date so you can see exactly where the money is going.
What I'm more concerned is you have had the full 824 made available to you. I guess that was my restatement.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It sounded earlier like you didn't have that much money transferred over, and I just wanted to clarify.
Well, there was $300,000 that initially was transferred over, and $200,000 of that was retracted or taken back. Was the point I was trying to make earlier. And I'm sorry.
So you're still 200 short that was already appropriated?
Well, it was kind of an odd deal, and the best we could figure is that $300,000 was going to be transferred to us and actually went into our budget last year, and $200,000 was taken back. Is that not?
Ladies and gentlemen, let me clarify. The prior ethics bill in the prior session, House Bill 244 that did not pass, that was the Ethics Reform Act, did not pass, but the Appropriations Committee appropriated funds assuming it would pass. And so what happened was, Secretary of State has the Campaign and Financial Disclosure unit, which consists of $212,000. That's 3 positions. In addition, in anticipation of House Bill 244 passing, the Appropriations Committee appropriated another $100,000. When the bill didn't pass, that money was in the Appropriations Act, but could not be spent. It was appropriated for a law that did not pass. So Secretary of State's office had to give that money back to the Treasury. So that's 100 of the $300,000 I think Rick is talking about. The other 212 was half of that money is already part of that $800,000 in the Ethics Commission. The other half of that money, for the other 6 months, is what's before you in the amended budget to be transferred to the Ethics Commission. So it'll be another $106,000 on top of the 826.
So, Representative, the answer is that we do not have that $100,000.
Nope, it was a treasury.
Okay.
The second question, if I may, seems that Representative Smith brought up the question on the filing. Last year, I do all my own filing on my own computer. The current system, the one that we just used in the end of December, we had to go in online and line item enter every transaction, basically, one at a time on a pre-mass screen. It would seem to me, and that's very timely because you have a small window to do that time in, that if a template, in simplicity, I'm going to say an Excel spreadsheet, was created where we and anybody else would have to file this throughout the year as we receive our contributions and make our expenses, could day by day make just a couple of entries on a template that you designed, and all we would have to do that final day is upload it rather than spend 12 hours
You could do that now, Representative. With the new system, since it's a web-based system, if you want to log on every day, you can enter that information. When you submit it, it saves it to our server. It is not public information, so it's exactly what you're talking about, and it is not submitted until you finally submit it whenever you decide to do that.
That's the same that we just,
No, this,
software hasn't changed? Or?
no, this is the new system that you will file for March 31st. You should be receiving, if you haven't already, it's called a CCDR PIN application. It's just for a password. If you complete that and send it back to us, we will email you a password. And when you log on, you'll be able to start entering in your expenditures and your contributions just into a template like you're talking about.
Thank you.
It's already there.
PIN number, but I didn't know quite what to do.
Yes, yes. As soon as you log in, you can start there. Yes, Representative.
Great assistance.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate your presentation. I'll make sure I get this correct. You're asking us, you're making a request for another $672,000.
That is correct.
We will certainly review that. We literally do not have $672,000. In retrospect, perhaps we should have asked the Secretary of State when she was here. It would seem, and I'll ask you the question. Wouldn't there have been resources in the Secretary of State's office that office will no longer be using now that they don't have responsibility?
Well, they have an infrastructure that when you do these kind of things, you piggyback off of other employees and other employees' responsibilities and servers and different things like that. So I don't know the answer to that. But if you were to give a portion of our duties right now to somebody else, they would say it would cost them more to build it from the ground up than we say it's taken for us to maintain it.
Okay, well, I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
I know that you all had, your office had met with some of us earlier this year, and I think it's appropriate for me to say this. It seems like there must have been a breakdown somewhere between your agency and the OPB, because they didn't, the governor's budget office, because it seems that they didn't see the needs that you have identified to us today. So we'll take this under consideration, and we will try to see how we can help, how the agency can, the commission can be helped. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, I think next we have, okay, I think we have another, under the Secretary of State's office, real estate, are you here?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Charles Clark, Real Estate Commissioner. The Real Estate Commission regulates Georgia's over 7,000 real estate appraisers and over 90,000 real estate brokers and salespersons, issue them licenses, and investigate complaints about their activities. In the supplemental budget for this year, the Office of Planning and Budget and the Governor have recommended $36,000 for our agency to replace 2 10-year-old cars. We don't have any other requests. If this is approved, it will be paid for not out of general revenues, but out of the fees that we charge to the people that we regulate. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions from the subcommittee? I don't see any. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know, Ms. Lagoda is here. Did you have anything in the budget you need to discuss with us?
No, sir, I don't. Sylvia Wago with the Holocaust Commission. Our mission is to work with the teachers K through 16 in providing character education and bring programs for community awareness. And we appreciate being in the budget and appreciate the fact that the governor's recommendation did not take the 2% from us, because that lets us keep someone in our office in Carrollton.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And if I'm not mistaken, next we have the governor's office.
Good afternoon. I'm Shelley Nicholl, the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. Thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to working with you during this session. It seems like OPB gets a lot of airtime during other people's presentations. We appreciate that. What I'm here today to talk to you about is, of course, the Governor's Office budget, the Office of Planning and Budget, and to inform you of the fact that the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget actually has 10 agencies that are attached to us for administrative purposes. Several of those people are here and would be available to testify in front of you. The Governor's Office of Planning and Budget's mission primarily is to present the Governor's budget recommendations to you. Most of our staff works on the executive level of preparing those budget recommendations along with agencies and presenting them to the governor, then making the recommendations to the General Assembly and monitoring the budgets throughout the year. We also perform program evaluations, management studies, house the state census documentation, and do other forms of administrative functions for those agencies. What you're seeing in our budget request for OPB proper is really some realignment of funds. You may or may not be aware of the fact that OPB houses the one financial system that is enterprise-wide for state government, which is the budget net system. That also includes a capital the capital operating budget, the budget system for capital projects to be requested and recommended, and also the Georgia Legislative Information System is operated out of OPB. So those three systems we house in-house in OPB. When I came as director early in July, I saw things that needed to be put up as a priority for us, updating BudgetNet so that state agencies could use it as a tool for preparing their budget development. And we are proposing moving some projects to the forefront. Therefore, what you're seeing is some transforming of the Office of Planning and Budget to be able to have BudgetNet do the things that it needs to do for state agencies. So we're moving money primarily out of personal services and operating into computer charges and contracts. And there is no net gain. We're not requesting new funds. We're just requesting that you give us the flexibility to move those funds where we actually need them to perform some new duty, not new duties, but to make the budget net system work more properly. And the other items that you are seeing are in each of the attached agencies, and I'll be glad to acknowledge the folks that are here. I think Bill Cloud is here from the Office of Consumer Affairs, Allison Anderson from the Office of the Child Advocate. I don't know, is Charlie here? Charlie from the Office of Homeland Security, and others are here. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions? Do we have any questions?
Thank you. That's correct. And that funding, Mr. Bill Cloud may want to answer the question, but it is for the governor's initiative on customer service, and the bulk of the funding is in computer charges and contracts. That's correct. It is a new initiative. There was a study conducted under the Commission for New Georgia last year, and this is to implement the recommendations of the study.
Earlier, we were in a discussion with the Secretary of State regarding some legal fees and funding that would come in, and it was presented that the governor's feedback from that from the governor?
Two facts that I can.
Heard
I did. Yes, I did. Two things. Since 1997, there have been no payments for legal fees out of the governor's emergency fund. Since Governor Perdue has taken office, he has made the governor's emergency fund be exactly that, to cover emergencies and disasters, and has carried that forward, that he will not pay for things ad hoc out of that fund. There have been appropriations for legal fees. So there may have been a payment prior to 1997 for legal fees out of the governor's discretionary fund, but they have been paid back through appropriations for legal obligations.
Mr. Chairman, I know I have a bad memory, but I am thinking, I thought that earlier it was just started since this administration, was what I heard. And I don't want to misrepresent what was shared at all.
I'm sure John's correct. I don't remember.
I thought that the Secretary of State told us that prior to this administration, they were paid out of the governor's emergency fund. And then what you just said was that since 1997,
We don't have records of any payments for legal fees being made out of the governor's emergency fund since 1997.
well, if any members of the committee, if I heard that wrong, I wish you'd correct me or point out to me, because what I'm seeing here is a conflict, and I'm trying to bring some resolution to it. If it wasn't paid out of
There were appropriations made to pay for legal fees.
after 1997,
Yes,
and in the budget through the legislature,
yes.
and prior to 1997, they were paid out of,
I can't answer that question.
but
And this was not, as the Secretary of State did say, this was not a budget issue. This was not a discussion during the governor's budget hearings. This was a letter that the Secretary of State sent to the governor. It was not a governor's Office of Planning and Budget decision. It was not presented as a budget discussion item. I'm just giving you background that I know of what has been paid out of the emergency fund and what hasn't.
Okay, I'd just like to get some clarification, Mr. Chairman, somewhere in this process. I'm hearing two different things being stated, and I don't know what to understand. And I'm not saying anyone's being untruthful. I just sure it may be a misunderstanding.
That's correct. We will make sure you get documentation of what's been paid out of the governor's emergency fund. Be glad to provide that for you. Sure.
Mills, we have some more questions. I don't know who was first. I'm going to go with Representative Hurd.
Following up on Representative Mills' question, isn't it possible that if legal fees come about on a short fuse notice sometimes without opportunity for appropriation, and I would assume that in the past those funds get paid either out of the governor's fund or out of the Secretary of State's fund, and then in the following legislative cycle, those funds are appropriated to reimburse those expenses. And isn't it possible that the Secretary of State could include it in her budget as pay it, and then include it in her budget as a reimbursement?
Absolutely.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
You're new on board as of
July 1st.
July 1st?
Yes.
You're doing fine. But
Thank you.
we all are trying to sort our way through this. And
Yes.
I guess the bottom line, as a policy for the state, we just don't want our bills hanging out there.
Absolutely.
And so if the money has not been appropriated, but the legislature can't add anything to the revenue estimate, so how do we problem solve? And that's what, I mean, how do we solve this problem if we don't have the money? So and it would be ongoing for the year, so, I think that's a policy decision all of us will have to face, and we're probably gonna need some kind of,
I agree. We do need to find an appropriate way to pay for it.
Thank you. Representative Blanche, you have a question?
Yes, I had another committee I had to deal with, and got in late on your presentation. However, I want to follow up on Representative Mills, and then I heard areas of the question. I think they have covered the current question of the funding of this federal ID bill. But could you shed us any light over how the fees were paid in regards to the lawsuit having to do with reapportionment?
We are making the governor is making a recommendation for the over $900,000 for reapportionment. Now, that's not legal fees. That I believe is for the postage and other things, but that was payments for the act of doing the reapportionment. I believe they've been appropriated. Kay, can you verify? They've been appropriated. Were they paid out of another budget first and then?
The last one that was appropriated, I believe, was an amended fiscal year 05, and it actually was put into the governor's office OPB.
The funds were put into OPB's budget, not in the governor's emergency fund. They were appropriated.
No, it was done in the amended budget, and the Secretary of State's office paid the bill, and then the funds were appropriated in the amended bill, and I believe it was in 05, and this was just the last instance, and then we reimbursed the Secretary of State for that particular legal bill.
Thank you, Representative Black.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a question, and I think we partially answered what I want to ask you. I need a little historical perspective here. Secretary of State said that these legal fees had been paid in the past, and I think there was some discussion. I'm not sure if it was paid out of the emergency fund or if it was paid out of other funds. But it seems like, isn't there a situation where you do some interagency transfers through fiscal affairs or whatever, maybe getting back to what was said over here, that if the Secretary of State had to pay for the postage or whatever, and then they were reimbursed, haven't we done some of that with these legal fees in the past?
I don't recall an interagency transfer. The way I believe it has worked is agencies have paid for these legal fees out of their budgets and have requested funding in an amended budget or in a regular budget after the fact to be reimbursed for those funds.
Well, we had an inter-office transfer from the governor's office just last year to pay $1 million in legal fees.
And we reimbursed you.
No.
I'm going to have to ask you not to have a discussion outside.
I'm sorry, but
Thank you, I appreciate it.
we'll do document.
Task here, thanks.
Can I ask you a question? Can I find out about the $1 million transfer that was out of the governor's office? I mean, I'm really trying to find out. And I think that's
what the question is.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer. I'll have to ask somebody else because I'm unaware of that situation.
And Mr. Chairman, I think one of the things that we as a legislature got to be careful of, like we were talking about the equipment that we're going to send to the counties and let them do this, which I think that's good, but somebody's going to pay for that, and it's not budgeted, as Smith pointed out. So out of a $17 billion budget or whatever it is, if we're going to pay for that, that means we're going to have to get it from somewhere else. We don't have the ability to add to it.
I don't have an answer, but thank you.
I don't know. Thank you.
I'll be glad to provide you with some historical data on how legal fees have been paid. We will.
I know you didn't create the situation. We appreciate you trying to address
Glad to.
questions the best you can. I will say, and I don't think I'm out of school for saying this, it does seem like a peculiar situation in this process. I understand that the bill, her charges came up, or her bill came in after, and she stated
Right.
that after the
Right.
request. It does seem like that there would be, there has to be some mechanism, and it doesn't seem like it would have to be that difficult. I mean, it's not that, I mean, it's a large amount of money, but it's not that large amount of money, and something has to be paid. But here again, it's not a situation that you create. And if you could, you know,
I'll be glad to.
meetings, you could provide us with any more information.
Sure will.
on that, or maybe how the, you know, how the governor's office, if, you know, if there is any plan to deal with that.
Okay.
It seems like a lot of times it could be handled through the appropriations process, but this is an example of how it would seem that the timing didn't provide for that
Right.
to be handled. So, but anyway, I appreciate you
Sure.
answering questions about that. I did want to ask you, I don't see any more lights right now, but if anybody else has questions, they can certainly ask. I did want to ask you about the $700,000, and this is under the Office of Consumer Affairs. But as I recall, and I may be mistaken, as I recall, in the 06 budget, general budget, that there was a request for $1 million for this, and that we cut it in half to $500,000. And I guess I'm a little bit curious. You know, we cut it based on information that we received, and our belief that the whole $1 million wasn't needed. But now in the amended budget, not only is the $500,000 being requested, but an additional $200,000. And I believe it was related to this same discussion. In fact, I know it was.
I believe the $500,000 was for the study that was conducted to find out what the state's needs were for this customer service initiative. This $700,000 is to begin the implementation of that project. It was a CNG initiative.
We were correct as a subcommittee to cut that in half. Is that right?
I have no judgment on that, but
But this is something, but you're telling us, I want to make sure that I understand this, you're telling us that this $700,000 is to be used for something different than that request last year.
yes,
It's related to the same project, but it's actually being used for something different.
yes.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions from the subcommittee? No further questions?
Thank you very much.
I don't take credit for turning the lights off.
Commissioners, turn the lights out.
Get over here, Charles, if you don't mind. Go ahead, Lynn.